I feel like sometimes I disappoint people when I'm not Chinese enough, even though I have a Chinese sounding name. Some of my Chinese friends also experience this, where their family calls them by their zodiacs. And I think having a more Chinese sounding name also makes people think that you identify with Chinese culture. I mean, this whole thing about making fun of our language or even accents as well, I think that's one of the stereotypes that I'm most afraid of.
Cynthia Tze Keng Ko is ethnically Chinese but born and raised in the Netherlands. Her family comes from Hong Kong, Malaysia and Indonesia. She's faced discrimination from a very young age, which made her struggle with her mental health. Seeking to create a social impact and explore her own identity as an ethnic minority woman who lives with chronic depression, she moved to London and has been working as a consumer researcher in diversity and inclusion over the past year. Recently, she has also been appointed as the youngest trustee at Mind, the national mental health charity in England and Wales. Today's episode features Cynthia sharing her experiences associated with her name and ethnic background. Cynthia recently decided to use her full name on social media platforms such as LinkedIn, as well as in job applications, despite being warned not to a few years ago due to discrimination she might experience due to her name. Names are enriched with meaning, are part of one's identity and hold such importance. Welcome to That's My Name. I'm Maya Mitsko September Welford. What's your name?
My full name is Cynthia Tze Keng Ko.
Hi Cynthia, it's really, really great to have you on That's My Name. And how are you known to your friends, family and loved ones?
I think most people just call me Cynthia because I'm not really used to using my full name. And even when my parents talk with me, they wouldn't be using my Chinese name either. They use nicknames, as often happens in families. So I don't know if this is a common thing, but I think some of my Chinese friends also experience this, where their family calls them by their zodiacs. So I'm a dog zodiac, in the Chinese zodiac. So I beat like a little dog, and in Chinese, then of course in English. And then my sister is a tiger, for example. And then my friends also have all sorts of nicknames for me.
Oh, I really like that. No, I've never heard before about being kind of nicknamed with your zodiac. I really like that. But yeah, never heard that. That's really, really cool. And I'm guessing then you're known to colleagues as Cynthia. Do you ever kind of tell them your full name at work or within like professional settings? Yeah, how do you kind of share your name with them?
I don't think I've ever verbally told my colleagues my full name unless they specifically ask about it because they're curious. Um, I think the times when they do discover my name, it would be in written form because when I sign off documents or when I put my name on a report that I've written, I tend to use my full name. Yeah, and recently I've also been starting to use my full name on social media as well. So I guess that's where they find out about my full name.
Mm-hmm. And what's kind of prompted this change to start using your full name more on social media?
I think it's been something that I've thought about for a long time, not because I want people to call me by my full name, but just because it represents something of my history. And for a long time, I was afraid to use it, especially when I came fresh out of uni.
Okay.
I was told that, using my full name might make people think that I'm this typical Chinese immigrant. It makes me sound really foreign. So I was afraid that it would lower my chances of getting a job. And nowadays, because I've been working for over a year already in diversity and inclusion, so I did consumer research around diversity and inclusion, where I've just been learning a lot about different marginalized communities. And I think it's just made me more curious about my own roots as well.
Yeah.
At this stage in my career, I'm going to change jobs as well soon in January. I just feel a little bit more confident that people will judge me by my abilities rather than the stereotypes that they have of me based on
Mm.
my
Yeah, definitely. And have you had any kind of discussions off the back of, and I guess this is one discussion today off the back of you using your full name more on social media, but have you had any particular kind of questions asked towards you or any has it sparked any discussions with other people?
Yeah, so I recently wrote a LinkedIn post about this, and I was really surprised at um, how well it did. I was literally just venting because I thought, I really need to clear this out of my head. And then there
Mm,
were so many comments on there. A lot of people from Southeast Asia and East
mm,
Asia telling me how they appreciate reading the story,
yeah.
knowing that the East Asian story or Southeast Asian story isn't really well represented in the UK. So
Hmm.
that's really, make me happy just to know that people feel like they're less alone. And
Yeah.
that's something that has always motivated me in life because I've gone through so many things in my life. I just never want people to feel like the way I ever did, whether it's due to
Mm.
racism or the mental health issues.
And do you think that some of those life experiences that you had were kind of directly tied to your name? And do you think that's part of the reason why perhaps you maybe use like a shortened version or didn't use or disclose your full name? Do you feel like some of these life experiences were directed towards your full name?
I don't think it was directed towards my full name because I never really used it.
Okay.
Um, and people can just see from looking at me that I'm not Western. So I
Mm,
grew up in the Netherlands and I was bullied from a very young age, probably the age of 8 or something. And people
wow.
would call me names, they would call me China. They would call me all sorts of Chinese food because that's the
Yeah.
only thing they know about Chinese culture, especially in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Chinese restaurants are everywhere there, and it's always something that I found really odd because
Mhm.
my parents own an Indonesian takeaway store, and people kind of mash it together. In the Netherlands, Chinese Indonesian restaurants are very prevalent.
Mhm.
So they customers come in and they love the food. They always praise us for how delicious Chinese food or Indonesian food is. But then at school, I realized that people actually make fun of me using those words.
Yeah.
So they would call me things like spring roll or babi
Wow.
panggang, which is actually Indonesian for a roasted pork dish. So that's already shows that people don't even know the difference between
Yeah.
Chinese culture and Indonesian culture. Then
Yeah.
and I thought it was because I lived in a small town. So that's
Mhm.
why during secondary school, I moved to Amsterdam. So it was a 1 hour commute, but I really wanted
Okay.
to get out of that toxic environment. And I thought living, or not living, but going to school in a diverse and big city would make a difference. But it
Mhm.
didn't. People
Mm.
proceeded bullying me
Wow.
because of my ethnicity. They would even call me Puka at one point, which is this cartoon character of this Chinese girl with,
Wow.
a very stereotypical look. So it's always been just the way I looked, and I was afraid that if I showed more of my ethnicity through my behavior, my thinking, or
Mm.
even my name, it would get worse.
Yeah, I can definitely resonate with a lot that you said there. So I'm half Japanese, so my mum is Japanese, and throughout primary school as well, I had other children making remarks and comments, and again linking to your point about people not necessarily knowing the difference and just kind of merging together people from kind of East Asia and Southeast Asia. They'd just say, oh well, like Chinese and Japanese are the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of again the food thing, just like ask me if I ate like dogs or like horses or just like kind of things like that, when actually like my family's vegetarian, or yeah, my parents and my sister and I were vegetarian. And then also kind of trying to like mock the language as well. I think that was a really big one
Yeah.
for me. It's like kind of making noises and sounds to try and imitate like a language. that they think that I would understand. So yeah, just a
I
lot
can
of that.
really relate to that. It's
Mm,
really strange how they, sometimes I just walk on the streets and someone says ni hao to me, even though I don't speak
mm,
English,
yeah,
or say something Japanese to me, even though I'm not Japanese.
yeah,
Uh, I just don't understand what makes people feel like they should stop someone on the streets and just say these random things to them.
yeah, yeah. No, I've experienced that too. When I was very young. I can't remember how old I was, but I was definitely in primary school, maybe like 8, and I was walking down the road with my mum, and across the other side of the road there was this like group of like older boys slash young men. Maybe they were like 18 or like 20, and they were just like shouting at her, like shouting what they thought was like Chinese or Japanese or whatever. Just like it for me, that is like racial abuse, and it's like
Mm.
it's very very sad that my mum, who wasn't born in the UK, to like have to experience that, especially while walking down the street with her very young daughter. It's yeah, it's definitely a memory that's kind of stuck with me, even though I was so young.
Yeah. I mean, this whole thing about making fun of our language or even accents as well, I think that's
Mm,
one of the stereotypes that I'm most afraid of, in a work setting,
mm,
at least, that people will make fun of how I pronounce things, because I'm
mm-hmm.
obviously not British. And also, when people make fun of Chinese people, it's always that they can't pronounce the L or the R,
Yeah. Mm,
as well. So all of these things really impact whether people think you're a capable employee as well, especially in the UK. I've had many times where people would look down on me or my family for not speaking a particular language. And I'm not
mm-hmm.
just speaking about English. It's always, I've always found it odd how people correlate intelligence with people's capability of speaking English.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
in the shop where I've worked with my parents since the age of 8 or something. We've had customers or children make fun of my dad's accent because he doesn't speak Dutch
Oh,
very well. Uh, or even my mom sometimes getting quite insecure around her Dutch and
mm,
English, even though
yeah,
she speaks literally 3 kinds of Chinese and
yeah.
Indonesian as well. And I'm just like, that's just so wonderful that you know all of these languages, but people don't appreciate you for that because it's not a language that equates intelligence in
Yeah.
society's view.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've had experiences living in different countries. So I know you've spent most of your life in the Netherlands,
Mhm.
but you've also had some experience in the UK, which you're in the UK now, and I know some experience in Australia. Thinking about these different countries and being in these different contexts, are there any kind of moments within any of these countries where you've been more consciously aware of your name, and also kind of things tied with your name? So I know that your ethnicity is very tied to, you kind of tie that to your name. So yeah, any particular experiences?
So in the Netherlands, because I haven't really used my name, I wouldn't really know whether that
Yeah.
has made any difference. But I know that ethnicity-wise, there is a little bit of a difference
Okay.
between the Netherlands and the UK.
Okay.
So in the Netherlands, I felt like Chinese Indonesian culture was everywhere,
Mm,
obviously because the Netherlands used to colonize Indonesia as well. So people kind of know a little bit more about it and appreciate it in a way, but also are quick to use it against you because it's just something that they see in you.
mm,
In
mm,
the UK, I felt much more at home with me because I live in London, so it's very diverse anyway.
yeah.
At the same time, it's also been a little bit odd because I am an ethnic minority, but at the same time, I'm not the ethnic minority that's often spoken about.
Mm,
Especially working in diversity inclusion, I quickly realized that when someone told me that, I'm Chinese, so my experience is very different from all the other racialized communities in the
mm,
UK, which makes sense because Chinese people are like 0.7% or something of the population in the UK, and they do tend to be well off. And there's this stereotype that Chinese people are the what do you call it again? The model minority, which is also a little bit annoying to me because that completely dismisses what kind of Chinese person we're talking about. Like, are we talking about a Chinese person that grew up in the UK or grew up somewhere else? Because me growing up in the Netherlands doesn't mean that I was well up. I mean, I've been working since the age of 8, and none of my parents went to university. And there's the stereotype that Chinese people are well off and smart, and they take all the jobs as well. That's what I've been reading anyway. And that's just not been my experience. You know, I had to work really hard to get where I am. I had to work for my scholarships to get into university. Even going to Australia, that was based on a scholarship as well. In Australia, it was a whole different view because I lived in Sydney for 6 months, and there were a lot of East and Southeast Asians in there. So the first moment I arrived there, I was like, oh wow, I thought I moved to Australia, but it feels like I'm in Singapore or something because I just saw so many people looking like me. And it actually felt kind of odd.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, like, how did that feel? Because I guess you've grown up for all of your life, as kind of not necessarily seeing lots of people that might look like you. So how did it feel when you were in Australia, to then see a lot of people that kind of looked like you?
I think it was just really weird to me because I looked like them, but I wasn't like them. Because when I interacted with them, they would usually speak in Mandarin, which is the language that I spoke, or even if they spoke in Cantonese, I'm not as comfortable speaking it. Most of my Cantonese I've learned from just speaking with my parents, and in my family there's a lot of languages. So if there's a family gathering, you might hear conversations in Hokkien, in Mandarin, in Chinese, in Indonesian. So I can kind of understand a little bit of all of that, but I don't feel comfortable conversing in any of it except Cantonese, but not in a very eloquent manner. So whenever I try to bond with people that look like me, I would often find that they automatically switch to a language that they're comfortable with. And then I would feel left out. And, you know, in a way, in the Netherlands, I feel like a very Chinese person, but whenever I'm outside of the Netherlands, I always feel like a Dutch person.
Yeah, it's an interesting one about kind of belonging. And yeah, I've definitely heard that from a few people, kind of depending on the country that they're in, they don't quite feel like they belong there because when they're in a certain country, then everyone thinks that they kind of fit in more in the other country that they're tied to. But then when they're in that other country, they feel more that they don't fit in there, but people around them feel that they fit in more with the other country. So I think it's an interesting.
And I think having a more Chinese sounding name also makes people think that you identify with Chinese culture, which of course I do in a way because, you know, my family and my culture and my roots are part of it. But then, you know, I feel like sometimes I disappoint people when I'm not Chinese enough, even though I have a Chinese sounding name. So they would assume that I maybe speak Chinese very fluently and I would be able to do interviews in Mandarin or something for my work. And then I can't. And it feels like I'm not being real enough to use my full name like that, even though it's just my name.
I understand that. Particularly with kind of my Japanese side. I think because I grew up in the UK, my dad's English, so kind of spent time growing up with more my English family and more exposed to kind of British culture. That when I go to Japan, I'm like, although this is like I'm half Japanese, I'm like I don't know exactly where I fit in. Especially as Japan's such a kind of monoculture. It's mostly Japanese people in Japan. I feel like I do stand out a lot kind of when I'm there, quite like visibly. And you mentioned that you're working in D&I, and it's the case that kind of certain ethnic backgrounds are more focused on at the moment, and perhaps like your experiences, while they're focused on, they might not be as focused on. And I think that you perhaps feel kind of clumped together with this notion that, well, Chinese people experience privilege, and I think you mentioned that people think that they're like the model kind of ethnic minority group. How does it make you feel, kind of as someone working in D&I? Yeah, how does that feel?
I mean, I think more work is being done to separate the experiences of different ethnic minority groups. For example, I think one of the broadcasting companies, they vowed to not use the word BAME anymore, which kind of assumes that all ethnic minority people or non-white people are the same. And I think that's really good, because every racialized community has a very different experience when it comes to racism. For me, it was mostly microaggression and also some stereotypes, but I didn't, go through the trauma of transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
Or my family did it. So I think it's important to recognize that different ethnic minority communities have different experiences, but I think people are quick to stop just there. Based on your ethnicity, you must have a certain experience. When it's also about your generation, are you first or second of your generation, that really does make a difference. And also, even though I'm fully Chinese by blood, by ethnicity, doesn't mean that I'm fully culturally Chinese as well, because my grandmother was born in Indonesia, and then my mom was born in Malaysia, and I basically grew up in an Indonesian shop all of my life. So I wouldn't say that I identify with typical Chinese culture as well. Sorry, I actually forgot your question.
No, that was okay. I was just asking around how kind of it makes you feel when particular ethnic groups perhaps focused on more within this narrative around diversity and inclusion. But I think you answered that really, really well.
I get it. Like, there are things that are very prevalent and happening right now. Black Lives Matter is a very important movement, and I do think that the Black community has undergone a lot of inequalities that need to be addressed. I think it's just a matter of patience as well. I mean, I know that when you try to become more diverse and inclusive as a company, or even as a country, you have to start listening to people's lived experience, and it's a slow process of building trust with these ethnic communities as well. So you can't do it all at once. But at the same time, of course, being someone of the minority, it sometimes feels like my view is also more easily dismissed. Also because I'm young, of course, so people dismiss my opinion more easily anyway. But that's another story.
And I know you mentioned that your name feels like it represents your history, your family history. So can you tell me a bit about kind of what your name means?
So my Chinese name. So in China, they used the first name, the surname first, right? So my Chinese name would be Ko Tze Keng. Ko is my surname, and Tze Keng are my Western middle names.
Yeah.
Tze means purple, and then King is of a flower. And the funny story is that when my mom called me King, based on the flower, she thought she was talking about the night blooming cereus, which is a flower that's some sort of cactus, and it only blooms once in its lifetime, and then it shuts forever. I always thought that was very beautiful, how because it kind of fit with my character as well, how I used to be very reserved, but when I open up, I do open up a lot. But then I found out that she kind of misunderstood, because in Hokkien, which is her native language, King is this flower that she meant it to be. But then obviously because my name is Cantonese, actually she named me another flower than she intended it to be. It's still a beautiful flower, but but it's different. But I still identify with the original meaning and the symbolism behind her naming as well.
Of course.
For me, a name is much more about the intent behind it than the actual name. Even when you think about my surname, it's probably not my original surname anyway, in terms of lineage, because my dad's father, he was adopted. So it's a different surname than what would be if my grandpa wasn't adopted.
Okay. And I know that you mentioned when we were speaking before that some of your distant relatives perhaps changed their surname. So is there anything around that you know?
Yeah, so over Christmas, I actually learned a lot more about my roots because I was really curious, and my mom explained all this to me. When my great grandfather from my mom's side moved from China to Indonesia, some of my relatives in Indonesia, they changed their names because of the government. They're basically not liking people to have Chinese sounding names, so they changed their surname to a more Indonesian sounding name. That's one name change that I'm aware of. And then there's a few random instances where people change their surnames either because they got adopted or because they moved countries. But that wasn't really because of political reasons, but just because it would make things easier in their life. So for me, it would be really hard to trace back my full origins based on surnames. And in a way, I sometimes envy people who can just say their great 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 grandfather was blah blah blah, and I'm like, well, I can't do that. And also as a woman, when I marry, maybe my surname might change, and then my children might not find my heritage as easily. So to me, a name doesn't mean as much in itself if you don't know the meaning behind it and the intent behind it.
So, Cynthia, I've really, really enjoyed having this discussion with you, and I feel like I've learned a lot more about you. So, thank you. Can you share with us what you're up to now?
So I recently got appointed as a trustee at Mind, the mental health charity.
Amazing.
And that was a shock to me in itself because it's a very large charity, and trustees generally aren't non-white and aren't young and aren't women. So this appointment really meant a lot to me, especially coming from this charity, because mental health is so important to me. I've suffered from chronic depression for a very long time, also as a result of the racial abuse that I faced. And Mind has recently changed the strategy to be more focused on becoming an anti-racist organization, and also to help young people more and people in poverty. So I feel like this charity really aligns with my values. So I'm excited to, represent young people and ethnic minority people more over the next few years in the mental health sector. Other than that, in my paid job, I am going to be a behavioral designer. So I come from a behavioral science and design background. And even though I really enjoyed working in diversity and inclusion, it was a research role. So I felt like my full skill set wasn't fully utilized. And I felt like I was missing out on creating actual solutions as well. When you're doing research, you learn a lot, and I'm very grateful for that. But then you write your report, and then you hope your client does something with it. And I think we have to move beyond just perception changes or bias changes when we want to tackle racism. I think behavior change is equally important when you, or even as a bystander. There's been so many instances where I faced racial abuse and people were just standing there not doing anything. In a way, that's even more damaging than the people shouting these things at you. So I'm really happy to be continuing what I learned in my education, something I worked really hard for, and continuing that in my employment. And I also do some volunteering work in the sustainability space. So I'm part of this
Cool.
organization called Slow Fashion Movement, and we have our own chapter in the UK called Slow Fashion UK as well. And that's really been my family over lockdown, my digital family. I've been meeting so many people from Indonesia to India to Puerto Rico, and this kind of diversity, being exposed to different people on different levels in my work, in my volunteering work. I think that really humbles you as a person and also connects you more with your own identity, because you get to reflect on how people identify with themselves as well. And then you start to think, is that how I identify, or is that what I struggle with as well? So yeah, I'm really grateful for everything that's going to happen in 2022 and really excited.
Yeah, no, I'm excited for you. It sounds like you've got some great kind of opportunities coming up. So I'm very excited. And how can people connect with you?
So I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. So you can just find me by typing Cynthia Tze Keng Ko or linkedin.com/in/Cynthia Ko. And yeah, I mean, I'm happy to connect with anyone that wants to discuss their experiences more in any of the spaces that I work in.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me as well. And I'm really glad that you're opening up the space for people to share their stories.